businesses and serving your communities to be here and learn how to make these parklets ADA accessible and safe. So the city is really grateful for everything you have done during the pandemic to serve your communities, retain your employees, but also your commitment to sticking with the parklet program in the future. So my name is Robin Abad-Acquavillo. I'm the program manager. I'm joined by deputy program managers Annie Yalon and Monica Munowicz, and staff from both the MTA and the Department of Public Works, Corinne Patel. Who else do we have here today? We have Mary L. Abea and Kelly Albers. Sorry, sometimes we only ever see each other on the screen, so seeing each other in person is very disorienting. I'm going to hand it off to Annie and Monica in just a second, but just a quick show of hands. Who here runs a small business in a neighborhood corridor? Okay, so that's the vast majority of folks. Restaurants. Okay, what about sort of more cafe format? Anyone serving alcohol? Yeah. Okay. We know that folks who currently serve alcohol and are relying on their parklets in order to do beverage service have questions about state legislation that's currently being considered. The good news is ABC wants to get looser than it was. What makes us all nervous is we're not exactly sure how they're going to do that. But I just want you to know that the city and our mayor's office is very committed to ensuring that we're working with our state delegation, that we're working with ABC, and we're working with all of you locally to develop recommendations that makes sure that our post-pandemic parklet program is supportive of our small businesses who are running them and have been, safely serving alcoholic beverages at those sites. So we won't have any answers here today about that particular issue, but please know that we're working really hard, and if you haven't been contacted already, either through the CDMA or the Office of Small Business, that city teams are working on making sure we shape that those ABC provisions in a manner that's supportive of us and other cities. What about anyone in the room who is not who's not operating a parklet, but is here because they design, build, and construct parklets? Or do we have any contractor designers in the house? Okay, at least one. Great. So with that, I think I'll step aside so we can get into the meat of this. And Monica, do I hand the... So this is Monica Munowicz, Deputy Program Manager, who's based at the SFMTA.
Good morning, folks. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yep.
Awesome. So Monica Munowicz, SFMTA, the Municipal Transportation Agency, we're particularly looking at footprint, just to sort of introduce and why I'm at a different department and what our agency does. So we're looking a lot about the feasibility of the space. Is it too close to an intersection? Is it on a street that has transit? Is it in a loading zone? So I'll primarily focus on some of those elements, and we'll be at a table after this, and I'll get actually a quick agenda. Today, we'll start off with the permitting process, sort of stepping through what are the major milestones and deadlines, and then get into why you're all here. What should your site plan include? Both the sort of conditional requirements and other documents required. Kelly will walk us through several examples, and then we'll be at the side at the end for a robust Q&A where you can come up, bring your site plan, ask us more detailed questions. And again, SFMTA, we're here, and I can really, my colleague and I, Corinne, can provide input on the footprint. Public Works, Kelly and Mary L. are really here to dive into the site itself, the parklet design requirements itself. So that's what we'll cover in our time today. The Shared Spaces Manual, hopefully you've all seen this online. We don't have it printed out today. It's a pretty long document. It is long because it has tons of helpful images to really help you guide through all the requirements that are very robust. But just wanted to have it up here that this is available to you if you haven't seen it on the website, and we won't go into it in detail today, but that training Andy mentioned later in October is a more robust training on this, on the document itself. So the site plan. This is the example rendering we provide in our materials. Hopefully many of you are familiar with this. A site plan does not have to be computer generated. It does not have to be submitted by an architect. It can be written up on a piece of paper as long as it has clear information, which I'll step through in a moment. But this rendering just kind of provides an example of the type of space, the type of dimensions, the type of sort of markation we want to say, but I want to reiterate, does not have to be computer generated and does not have to be done by an architect. So just to go into some of the specific requirements, to dive right in, many of you may need to provide neighbor consent. These images are in our manual but show when neighbor consent is required. That's when, if you're in a metered block, so you have marked parking spaces, if your parking space it goes into your neighbor's frontage, over 50% of that parking space, you need consent. And if it's an unmetered block, so that's not marked parking spaces, even if it's a foot into your neighbor's frontage, you need consent. So we can elaborate on this further, but I just wanted to talk through what we need by neighbor consent and how we need that to come to us. It's in this formal letter, so even if you got someone a year ago, or 2 years ago, or 6 months ago to give you consent, we need a new, fresh consent and in this template, in this letter. So just want to start off and call that out, as it applies to potentially many of you. Then site photos. This is another specific thing you'll see in the application submittal. We have this diagram to show sort of the 5 key areas where we want photos, 2 from the sidewalk, 3 from the street, that really provide sort of the whole view around the parklet. This is because we may not have been out to the site in the last few weeks. Maybe Google Street View is not totally up to speed, and so it's been a great resource, but not always up to date. So these photos are really, really helpful for us to understand what's on the ground. And just to show a few images what that looks like. These are the 3 from the street that shows sort of either side and directly in the middle, sort of all around, and then the 2 from the sidewalk from either side. So neighbor consent, photos. I'll go through the timeline and then start talking about that site plan I showed earlier before passing it over to Kelly. So November 1st, this seemed like so long ago when we first started publicizing this, but it's coming up in just a few weeks. Post-pandemic permit applications are due November 1st. This is for everything that wants to operate starting April 2023. When we receive that application, as many of you have already submitted, our team, first MTA reviews it and then gets passed to Public Works, but we'll review your application and site plan. There may be some back and forth about missing materials or questions that we have. But once that sort of back and forth happens and the site plan is approved, Public Works will go out and give post a 10-day public notice. This is new, a part of the permitted program. We did not do this for the pandemic program. But there's this 10-day public notice. Once that has passed and it all is good, you are conditionally approved. And then you'll have to make the changes. Many of you don't have the changes necessarily made at the time you submit your site plan, and that is okay. But at that point, you would make your changes, do the construction, and after the construction is complete, Public Works does a site visit, make sure everything matches the application, and you're given your formal permit at that time. And your site signage. There's sort of provided branded shared spaces signage that are given to all parklets, and you're given that at that time. So I know that was a lot, but we could go back to that if you have any questions. So, site plan checklist. I want to just go over some of the core elements that were in that image before that I showed. It's a bird's eye view, and can be computer generated or written, but we need to see the footprint of your business. Clearly your name, where your neighbors are, so we can identify consent is required. The neighbors, sort of where their frontage starts and ends. The sidewalk and street fronting businesses, so the width of the sidewalk. A north arrow, so we can orient on the street. Street names and crosswalks. Sort of just drawing what you see on the street is really important. Color curves, if there's red that you see. If your parklet's in a yellow zone, any of that color on the curve, blue zones, we want you to be marking that up. If it's gray, that's just unpainted curve. The total length of your parklet and the width. So generally 7 feet is the width that we see, but length and width. The markings of the parking spaces is so important. We see that missing a lot, but if you're an unmetered block, no problem. But if you are in a metered block that has the spaces, we want to see those T's. That helps orient us. It's really important. And then utilities. There's utilities in the street, and we need to keep clear of those, so those need to be marked up in your drawing as well. So we can go back to this at the end, but this is like a quick run through of those 4 elements we really need to see on site plans. Now Kelly will go over some of the more nuances and specifics of the site plan itself. Thank you.
Everyone, can you hear me okay? My name is Kelly Albers. I worked in Public Works for the past 4 years, and prior to the pandemic, I worked on having tables and chairs display merchandise permit applications. So if you've had those permits, you've probably seen my name in your inbox. I'm going to go over some of the requirements as well as site plan examples from applications we've received in the past. So these are items not shown on the site plan because we do not require elevations or sectional views of your site plan. There are conditional requirements that you must comply with, and these are, you indicate compliance by filling out the certifications form. And you can grab a form over there if you need one. So some of the requirements: wall height. The wall height of your structure should not exceed 42 inches. If you do install anything above 42 inches, it needs to be made of transparent materials. The roof has a minimum height requirement of 7 feet and a maximum height requirement of 10 feet, and we do not allow roofs on structures adjacent to sidewalks less than 10 feet wide. This is a requirement by the fire department, and it allows for them to have that for laddering to the buildings. The structure may also not obstruct vertical clearance for emergency access gaps. We do need a 3-foot-wide clearance for horizontal and vertical clearance, and structure may not be installed above the sidewalk. Another requirement is the 6-inch by 6-inch gutter clearance of the curb along the entire length of the structure, and this is for drainage. We also require ADA seating within the structure, so the structure should be flush with the sidewalk and at least a 4-foot-wide gap from the sidewalk to the structure, and there needs to be at least one ADA table that abides by the design guidelines. It needs to be 28 inches tall with a 30 by 40 clear space underneath that table. A new requirement is also the public seating requirement. We do require 1 bench or seating arrangement to be available to the public within the structure. And then wheel stops and soft hit posts are required on both ends of the structure, and we should be aligned with the 3-foot setbacks on both sides. Other documents that are required upon submittal, so I referenced the requirements previously. These are on the certifications form, and the checklist must be filled out completely. We also require a certificate of insurance for commercial general liability coverage, and we do have specific language requirements. The sample is shown here on the site. We also require a signed neighboring consent form, and this is only if it's applicable to your case. If you're occupying neighboring frontage, that form needs to be completed by either the tenant or property owner of that neighboring frontage. And Monica mentioned before, current photos of the site are very helpful for our review. So I'm going to go through a couple site plan examples. This is a site plan submitted by a coffee shop in the Marina District. As you can see, it's computer generated, but it's not necessarily done by a professional. I actually believe that they use our sample site plan as reference, so you can do that as well. Some items that we noticed on this one that are missing are the extent of the encroachment on the neighboring frontage, so we do want you to mention that in order for us to determine whether or not we need neighboring consent. SFMTA also provides us with their permitted scope of occupancy, so we do want to make sure that the structure you are outlining on the site plan matches the dimensions that they are accepting. This site plan shows the required setbacks on both sides, so you can see that they have 3-foot-wide setbacks. And it also shows the locations of surface obstructions, such as tree wells, parking meters. We also like to see the parking tees and meters on the sidewalk if it is a marked parking space, and official sidewalk width. And in this case, the structure is less than 20 feet wide, so they do not need the emergency access gap. Here's a site plan for a restaurant in Hayes Valley. So we do accept hand-drawn site plans, but the lines should be straight and the dimensions should be legible. In this particular case, they are missing the location of the surface obstructions, which we pointed out in the red comments. We also need to see the extent of the encroachment onto a neighboring frontage. So as you can see, part of their parklet will encroach onto the neighboring frontage, so we want that to be dimensioned. The dimensions also need to align with MTA's permitted scope of occupancy. So you can see down there, MTA is permitting 41 linear feet, so we want the length of the structure as well as the setbacks to fit within that permitted scope. This site also has a PG&E example right in front of the business frontage, so we need a clearance from that. I believe it's a 3-foot clearance around the radius of the manhole. So here's another hand-drawn site plan, and this one was actually acceptable upon submittal. You can see the lines are straight, all of the dimensions are provided. It is on a property corner, so we do require the clearance from the intersection. They also dimensioned the sidewalk, and in this case, it is 6 feet wide, so a roof would not be allowed on the structure. You're showing the 3-foot emergency access gap in the center, as well as 3-foot setbacks on either side. Here's another one, and this one actually used our sample site plan as the foundation. As you can see, they modified it according to what their business frontage looks like. You can see that they're encroaching onto neighbor frontage, so we asked for them to dimension that accordingly. And in this particular instance, MTA is granting them occupancy of 40 linear feet, but they need to modify that structure so that the setbacks on both sides fit within that 40 linear feet. They're also showing the color curve, there's a yellow curve, and the distance from the crosswalk. Here is another site plan. This is actually computer generated, but you can see that there are hand-drawn elements. This one actually shows structures on both frontages, which is allowed, but there are required clearances for daylighting. As you can see, a 20-foot clearance for the near side on this Clement Street side, and an 8-foot clearance for the far side, which is 19th Avenue. It's 20 feet for near side, 8 feet for far side. And this one is only missing a couple surface obstructions, and then there is a driveway on 19th Avenue, so they need a minimum 2-foot clearance from that driveway. Last site plan example, so this one is actually a 3D rendering. It doesn't show a bird's eye view of the site plan, so it's missing the information required to identify the location of the proposed shared space. As you can see, it's difficult to tell exactly where this business is located and where they're planning on putting their structure. It doesn't show the business frontage, the sidewalk space, or the parking lane, and it's also missing dimensions such as the length and width of the structure. I'm just going to go through this slide very quickly. Other resources for businesses. So all of our resources are available on our Shared Spaces SF.gov website. There's a permit application worksheet, which lists all the required documents for submittal, the updated Shared Spaces manual, and then we also have parklet design trainings. The next one is next week on October 27th. And we also have a list of architects, designers, and builders who have attended our parklet design trainings in the past. I'm going to pass it on to Robin or Annie. I think it's Q&A time.
Thank you, Kelly.
I know everybody has lots of questions, but we were thinking we would use about 10 minutes of group question time, and then we have staff members from our different city agencies that can answer more specific questions that might only pertain to your parklet. So I just wanted to take a moment really quick to introduce our staff. So for your general shared spaces questions, this will be after we have some group questions. Robin and I will be here to answer those. If they're just general questions about maybe one of our design guidelines, for example. This is Marielle, and this is where Kelly will also be sitting to answer questions related to public works. So maybe you have a table and chairs permit that you have a question for, or a site plan that you brought that you maybe wanted some feedback on, we'd be able to help you with that. And then this is Lynn, and this is where Monica will be sitting for SFMTA related questions. Maybe you have a question about a color curve, a loading zone, or something specific to the footprint of your parklet. And so that's the way we want it done. But are there any questions that would be appropriate for the group? Back. So your hand first.
And if you could tell us your name and where you're from, that'd be awesome.
My name is Debbie Allen Asiento, 21st and Bryant. It's a bar, but we serve food. I've asked a few times actually over the last couple of years about the ABC requirement because we either have to have the public bench unlicensed or something like that, and it's been a long, hard road, and I asked in our last meeting, we do need the answers for this. This isn't something that can be pushed out. We don't want to get cited for something that we don't have control over, and they say we still don't have the answer, but it's good if you guys start pushing on the ABC.
Thank you, Debbie. Yeah, that's a great question, and we talked about this a little bit at the top, so folks who maybe rolled in a little bit later. We are currently working, the city, our mayor's office and OAWD are currently working right now with ABC to refine, what's proposed in legislation. The good news is that ABC wants to come looser than they ever have before. What's making us all uncomfortable is that those rules aren't set yet. So please know that the city is working to make strong recommendations about how, we have a post-COVID parklet program that is, supportive of everyone here who is serving alcohol, who has been safely serving alcohol in your parklet. So unfortunately, no answers now, but know that the city is working on this. We're not the only municipality in the state who is keenly interested in making sure that state rules are supportive of local programs. So please stay tuned. There should be some local outreach as well to, especially bar owners, but other folks who are serving alcohol, and that's being led up by our colleagues at OEWD. Next question.
I have a couple of questions, I hope that's okay. One is, the deadline is, oh, I'm sorry, Patricia Dedekian, I'm with Curio on Valencia Street. And if we submit our application just at the deadline, but then you have issues, is there an opportunity for feedback, or does it just get rejected?
I'm so glad you asked that if that wasn't clear. Of course, that is like what our job and what we're here to do is to provide that back and forth. So yes, don't feel nervous about submit things. Obviously, if they're as complete as possible, it makes everyone's life easier. That's why we're doing these trainings. But by all means, we're here to answer your questions, give feedback, and that discourse can happen, in the weeks following the deadline.
And then I just have one other question. I know this is about parklets specifically, but our shared spaces includes a parking lot and also a sidewalk. So should that be part of this submittal as well?
Yes, thank you for asking that question, and also just a special thanks to Curio for hosting us when the mayor signed legislation making this program permanent last year. So it's very gracious of you guys to have us there on Valencia Street. So if you have a parking lane, well, I'll actually let Kelly answer whether or not how you should submit if you have a parking lane as well as a sidewalk. But if you have a lot, and it's a private lot, not a city lot, then you will need to submit an application that's separate from your parklet permit. Communications from the program have been going out about that, so let's check in later if you haven't gotten that communication. For private lots, the entitlement or the approval actually comes from the planning department, whereas for a parklet, the permit comes from DPW, right? Because that's the way that the law works. So you'll probably be directed to apply for either a temporary use authorization or a conditional use authorization for continued outdoor activation of that lot, depending on what's going on at your site. So let's check in afterwards. And I'll hand the mic over to Kelly Albers from Public Works, who can talk about how to submit for.
So if you have sidewalk seating and you already have a permit on file, cafe tables and chairs permit on file, we can go ahead and renew it so long as the layout that is implemented matches the site plan that we already have on file for your business. But if you do not have an application already in, you can go ahead and submit through the same online portal for parking lane shared spaces. Just indicate that it's your sidewalk occupancy. You can do those concurrently.
So Kelly, does that mean you could do one application, you could submit for both your sidewalk and your parklet at the same submittal?
I don't know how the online portal works in that regard, but I do believe that you can click on both at the same time.
You can.
Yeah, and then submit. There is a separate site plan requirement for tables and chairs, so you do need to show the amount of tables and chairs you're placing on the sidewalk, as well as the dimensions, the diverter requirement, and all of that. And then we will review it separately. So with parking lane shared spaces, MTA comes in, does the review first, but for cafe tables and chairs, Public Works will do the review.
And just one thing to follow up. One of the resources in your hand is the application worksheet, and that is a literal copy of the application that's online. Just one thing I wanted to note for everyone in the room here today. This is an important resource that also lives on our website. Once you begin your application, unfortunately, due to the restrictions of our government websites, you will not be able to save it. So this application worksheet is for you to prepare in advance and get all your materials ready to apply, so. And you had one more, sorry.
So we had original sidewalk seating approved like several years ago, but it was much more restrictive than what was allowed under shared spaces. We could put a lot more sidewalk tables out under that program. So is that what we use now for our template?
Yes, so if you're planning on modifying your pre-pandemic approved cafe tables and chairs application, making any modifications to the site plan at all, you would need to submit a new application, and then we would review it to be in compliance with current requirements.
Question in the back.
Could you speak a bit? I'm sorry, my name is Shanae. I'm here with Adobe Books. If you could speak a bit more on how getting neighbor consent is determined, and if it's as simple as the neighbor doesn't want you to have one, so you can't, or if it's a bit more, yeah.
I'm gonna pull up the neighboring consent, actually, if you go to that slide as well. So there are 4 different options for neighboring consent. Are you referring to sidewalk occupancy or parking lane occupancy? Just to be sure, because I know there are different things. Parking lane, okay.
Parklet or tables and chairs?
This is for a park.
Parklet, okay. So for marked parking spaces, you would be required to obtain neighboring consent from the neighbor if it is occupying more than 50% of that neighbor's frontage. I think it is option number 3. Yeah, sends at least half of one marked parking space into a neighboring frontage, so you would need to obtain neighboring consent from either the tenant or the property owner. And unfortunately, if that neighbor does not provide you with consent, you wouldn't be granted occupancy of that space. And then for unmarked parking spaces, neighboring consent is required if you're occupying any extent of that frontage.
I also just want to pull back a little bit and observe how much the city has tried to make this program easier. Before the pandemic, if you wanted to have a parklet period, you needed to have both of your neighbors' consent. So these new requirements that are up on the screen right now are much more flexible, right? It's no longer always a requirement. So I just wanted to acknowledge that we learned a lot during the pandemic, and we wanted to, moving forward, make things easier than they were before the pandemic. Does that answer your question?
I think it does, yeah.
Great.
And just also wanted to give a shout out to the shared spaces manual here. This information and these diagrams, most of what you're seeing in this presentation, which will be emailed to you as well, is also in our shared spaces manual. We have, we'll do 2 more questions.
My name is Dave with Foghorn Tap Room. I just want to piggyback on that one. Yes, we're in the process of getting consent from a neighbor. Can the neighbor revoke consent at any time after you've built this? Is it an ongoing thing? At what point can she pull it back? And then also, I just heard you said that the landlord can give consent to. Would that supersede or go past the neighbor saying no if the landlord said yes?
And by the neighbor, you're talking about a
That neighbor's
business.
business.
Business versus landlord.
Like, I definitely need her consent, judging by the thing.
At least I'll try, and the first question, consent, when it's granted, is for a year. So if someone revokes within that year, they are committing them, they're ready for a year. But after that point, when you're renewing, you're gonna have to get continued neighbor consent. So at that point, they could change their mind after that year.
If they say no, we have to pull it out, basically.
The part that is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of obtaining consent from the landlord, it depends on the occupants of the building. For instance, if there are multiple tenants on the first floor and you will be occupying that parking space fronting that building, then you would require permission from all the tenants. There are nuances to the requirements, so we just ask that you submit the neighbor consent form and then we'll verify compliance.
And the last thing is with the 10-day posting. So if she says doesn't give, or she gives, if she doesn't give consent, we restrict it back to our building storefront. that 10 days, is she able to say, I don't want it there and that's over? Or are we, or, you know what I'm saying?
So with the 10-day public notification period, these parklet permits that we're reviewing are actually not subject to a public works hearing upon submittal of an objection. We document the complaints, we try to mediate the discussion between the applicant as well as the complainant. But these permits are appealable come March 31st, 2023, so somebody could file an appeal against the issuance of the permit, but you'll not be held back if a complaint is submitted during the 10-day public notification period.
Hi,
Great, so
Greg.
we have, oh, sorry, Greg, just one clarification, thank you. Is that over the pandemic, we saw a lot of parklets sort of take up half of a parking space or kind of be offset. Moving forward, we really need parklet installations, the actual build-outs, to be within the bounds of that marked parking stall. So, you know, it's a really dynamic part of the street, right? MTA is working really hard to make sure we have adequate loading, passenger loading, commercial loading, all things that also service and support the health of your businesses. So, you know, if your neighbor, maybe you want to occupy a space that's like mostly in front of your neighbor, they say no, that doesn't mean that, you know, that MTA is going to let you take like that 30% of that parking space, right? That the entirety of that parking space needs to be available for other uses. So that's come up a little bit. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you. Greg, Flanagan's Pub. We should all come by for Shop Jameson after this. You're gonna need it. If we can go over fees super quickly, just what this is gonna cost on a one-time basis, on an annual basis. Specifically, it seems like you're charging 5 parking spaces as well. So any detail on that would be great.
I think Rob's gonna pull up the slide. It's in the slide deck as a resource, so when we send this out to you, you'll have this available. Yeah, we didn't cover it, so thank you for asking. So up here you'll see there's 3 different fees for the permit, the one time, depending on the tier. So if you're a public parklet, it's $1,000. A movable parklet, it's $2,000. The commercial structured parklet is $3,000. And then that's just for the first space. If you have the second space, that's what that second column, an additional $250, $1,000, or $1,500. And then there's an annual license fee, and that's on the right-hand column. All of this, there's a half-off fee waiver if your business earns less than $2 million in gross receipts. So you may be eligible for that. That's what's noted on the bottom there. But at a high level, does that make sense? Does that answer the question? Or was there
Marked versus unmarked, though. How are you qualifying the parking spot?
Around 25 feet. We are still, Public Works and MTA sort of finalizing that number, but it'll probably be somewhere around there. But thanks for asking, because that is not clear when it's unmarked.
Also, a note of clarification about this fee schedule. Before COVID, parklet permitting fees could go up to as much as $8,000 per space. So another thing the city has tried to do in listening to all of you over the pandemic about how we make this program permanent, how we transition it post-COVID to something that's a lasting feature, is radically reducing the fee that you have to pay to just create a parklet. We know it's a huge responsibility, it's a huge capital outlay for you all. So in an effort to make it more accessible generally, fees are vastly reduced. These fees do not subsidize the program. The city actually subsidizes the administration of this program. I know that's a question that's come up a lot. So we are endeavoring as much as possible to lower barriers so that as many folks as possible can participate in the program.
Hi, I'm Ada from Cafe Trias. My question is, if you have more than 2 meters or spaces in front of your business or along your business, will there be an application, or can you apply for an exception to have one or two more additional spaces?
Yes. Actually, we should have had that in the presentation. I'm glad that you asked about that. So the cap, what's written in the legislation or program regulation, is 2 spaces per business, no more than. So that's regardless of sort of your frontage. It's about, you come in with 2 spaces, that doesn't need an exception. If it is more than 2 spaces, we consider that on a case-by-case basis. So we look for things like, is it a street of transit? Are loading needs met? Is it maybe more residential than commercial? Just to share sort of some of the parameters, and then we'll get back to you if it's possible to have 3, for example.
And one more question. I have 2 storefronts, 2 licenses at my business. one is food and beverage, the other one's retail, can you get, if it's split up, because, if they say you can't have it, can you have alcohol license for the other one? For the retail one?
I think we might need to double back on the ABC provision. Unfortunately, the city wants to know too. We want these regulations to be stable and predictable. So let's check in later about that. But yeah, I think big picture, MTA needs to make sure that the streets and sidewalks are safe, that especially loading needs are adequate, right? And so that's when the city's looking overall at a block or a corridor, we're trying to consider all those things, and those are going to shape how many spaces, for this permit application at least, the city's going to feel comfortable granting at this time.
Yes, hi, my name is Alexandra. I own Settleball Wine Bar. I remember you coming for the signature of the permanent permit. I just want to address, the issue we're facing. My business is actually right in front of the business. The parklet is actually located on like 2 half spaces. I mean, it's unfortunate that there's not like an actual space. And so for that, in that regards, we got a special authorization until now to have it seated there, because we've had like a lot of troubles with our neighbors. I mean, our commercial neighbor, and I think you remember what happened at the time of the signature of the mayor when you guys came. This neighbor has been creating a lot of issues in the neighborhood, and I know for sure that I will never get any consent whatsoever with this guy. So, question is like, can we keep that special authorization based on that situation? Also, the other question I have is on both sides of the businesses, both sides of my business actually, there are 2 entrance doors to, upstairs neighbors, like living upstairs. Is that space available for us to use, or do I need also to get the consent of the neighbors upstairs?
Maybe the first part of that question. So that's a really tricky one. Even if it sounds like you look for one space, one of the 2, or even if you're in the middle, it is considered, even if your sort of parklet is in the middle, which is to Robin's point earlier, we don't permit partial parking spaces, we don't want to see that, but in the instance you build, we still consider that entire parking space your footprint, even if you don't build into it because of the neighbor issues. So therefore, you still need to get the neighbor consent. That's how we handle this sort of citywide. That parking space, if it's 50% over, even if you're not building into it, it's part of your, think of a zone or footprint of space. And so it would trigger that need for consent. And that's really unfortunate. I don't want to say I'm really sorry.
Well, is there a person I could address this question to?
Let's take this one offline and out of the big group.
I think.
And then, so we're going to take one more question. This laptop needs to go elsewhere, so we won't have this resource anymore, and then we can break out into, into questions that you guys can ask specifically of city staff. So there's 2 folks from MTA, 2 folks from planning, and 2 folks from DPW. So the second part of the question was whether or not you're going to need consent from folks who live on upper floors, if say they have a residential entrance, right, that of course is on the sidewalk. Right now the code, the way that the Board of Supervisors wrote this provision and passed this provision is that it's for the ground floor tenants or occupants. So that's usually a tenancy with, right, a business that's renting. You don't need to ask every single person who lives in the vertical stack of the building for consent. It's really focused on how your operations might impact the operations of your neighbors on the ground floor. So there's one more question here at the front, and then we're gonna move to, we're gonna break out.
Hi, my name is Morgan. I'm from the Burpees restaurant. So option 1, if you are not exceeding the neighbors, are you still need a consent forms from neighbors?
No.
No, these option 1s.
That's correct.
Okay.
Okay, so I think we'll take the rest.
I think we'll take the rest of the time to break out into individual scenarios, individual questions. So Robin will be sitting at this first table here, then we have Public Works and SFMTA. Thank you.
So follow me. So actually, if you have questions for planning, I'll be over here. MTA and DPW are each gonna have 2 tables on that side of the room.